Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. This parsha, of course, is Parshat Vaetchanan, which is always the parsha and the Shabbat, which follows Tisha B'Av. And of course, having gone through the trial of the 3 weeks, we're now ready to go on to complete the rest of our summer months. Okay, so we'll get started now. This week, we're going to talk about a mitzvah in the Torah, which is really not necessarily numbered among the mitzvot. But there are a couple of prakim which are here, a couple of psukim which we have, and I will read them for you. The Torah first does give us the mitzvah of lo tenasu et Hashem Elokechem, that the first thing we're to know as Jews, don't test God. What does it mean, don't test God? It means, for many, one way to interpret it, of course, is don't ask of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what have you done for me lately? Because as Jews, we know that Hashem is always with us. And because he is, in fact, always with us, so we are always grateful for what we have and what he's given us. And we know that he's not going to literally leave us. Sometimes we find David Melech and others, using the phrase, don't abandon me, please don't abandon me. But of course, we know Hashem never abandons the Jewish people. But what it means is to say, please don't put me in a position where it will feel that I am completely alone. That we, of course, know we're never alone. So now let's turn to Perek Vav, this chapter 6, Pasuk Yud Chet. The Torah tells us that we are, again, not to test HaKadosh Baruch Hu by constantly trying to see if he will respond to what our needs are. And then the Torah tells us in Pasuk Yud Chet, V'asita hayashar v'hatov b'yeinei Hashem. We are told that even though this is not in itself a specific mitzvah, as the Torah Tamima tells us, the Torah can give us 613 mitzvot, and there are also definitions for the mitzvot that we have. However, the Torah itself does not cover each and every situation. When the poor person comes to your door, or when you are faced with a business issue which is uncertain, the Torah tells us that there's a sort of an omnibus halacha here, an omnibus statement and declaration. When it's not completely covered, then v'asita hayashar v'hatov b'yeinei Hashem. Your job is to do that which is straight. Yashar means straight. V'hatov, and that which is good, b'yeinei Hashem. When you're not certain, that's what you do. L'man yitav lach. Why? Because God has given you mitzvot to act that even though right now you don't know what's necessarily going to be good for you, Hashem gives you the mitzvah and the ability through the Torah that we learn. You have a chance, of course, to ask a posek, a gadol, how to perform in such a situation. Of course, you do that. But in general, that's what the Torah tells us. You need to ask yourself, what is yashar? What is straight, v'hatov, and what is good? Now, Rashi, on this particular pasuk, tells us the following. Hayashar v'hatov, 2 words that seem to be general. In other words, we have halachot. How do you put on tefillin? Even though the Torah doesn't tell us every specific detail, there are halachot as to what of the 39 malachot on Shabbat. But hayashar v'hatov, that which is straight and that which is good, we don't really have a directive with defining exactly what that is. So Rashi gives us a little bit of an inkling of help. Hayashar v'hatov, zo shara. This is compromise. Torah tells us that we are that compromising is good. It's not a sign of weakness when one compromises, but it is actually a sign of strength. Zo pshara, that Rashi says, and that is lifnim mishurat hadin. Now, normally this phrase, which is used fairly often in Shas and in Halacha, lifnim mishurat hadin, we normally interpret as beyond the letter of the law. Rashi says pshara, compromise. Then he says lifnim mishurat hadin. And of course, that's a pretty good working definition of lifnim mishurat hadin. But I'm not so sure that it's completely accurate. Because if we were going to say beyond the letter of the law, we would say me'al the shurat hadin, beyond the letter or the line of the law. But that's not the phrase that Chazal chose. Chazal chose the word lifnim mishurat. Lifnim pnima means the inner understandings of the law itself. And that's extremely important, that we have to understand that, Chazal, and I mentioned this last week when we talked about the destruction of Yerushalayim, that one view in the Gemara is that Yerushalayim was destroyed mipnei she'amidu al din Torah, that the judges stood on the letter of the law, the letter itself, and because they only dealt with the letter of the law, but they didn't deal with all of the ramifications of their judgment. The rich person, the poor person, how will this affect each person emotionally? How will it affect the life of the person, the economic life of the person against whom the judgment is brought and determined? That doesn't mean that we pervert the law. The law is the law. Whether the person is rich or poor, if they themselves, whether the person is rich or poor, if that person maybe did not follow the halacha in the instance that we're talking about, of course you can't judge him. You can't render a judgment in his favor. But we are obligated to say, how is this going to affect the person? And that, by the way, Rav Hirsch mentions, as we will see later, is where the concept of hatov, v'asita hayashar vehatov. Yashar is, says Rashi, is pshara. Come to an agreement between you. Don't always claim everything you're entitled to. Very interesting concept. And we call that in both modern Hebrew and in rabbinic Hebrew, vitur, levater. Levater means not to forego some of your rights, even though you're entitled to it. Not to claim all of your rights all of the time. Now that's a tough thing. In America, we ask the question, that's the main question that people ask, what are my rights? But in Judaism, that's not first and only question we ask. It is, what are my responsibilities? What are my responsibilities toward the Torah? What are my responsibilities toward my fellow human being? What are my responsibilities toward the person with whom I'm disagreeing right now? So when the Torah says, "V'asita yashar v'atov," it is that, yes, if you can compromise and by not claiming all of your rights, you can bring peace, that's good. That does not mean that you're not allowed to have the din Torah. Of course you're allowed to have the din Torah. There's provision for it. The Torah tells us, "Shoftim v'shotarim titein lecha b'chol sharach." Judaism demanded that there be a court whenever a village or a town reached a certain number of Jews. There's an obligation to establish a court. So they're not established for no reason. But the question is, I myself, you yourself, if it's possible to reach a compromise, even though I didn't get everything that I'm completely entitled to, that's pshara. That's hayashar v'atov. That's what Rashi. Now, This week, of course, we lost a giant in the world of Torah, in the world of generous human beings, Mr. Rabbi Yaakov Reichenbach. I had the schus of knowing Yaakov for over 60 years. And those of you, if you heard his, the many hespedim that were given at the time of the Levaya, which was on Tisha B'Av itself, they could have gone on for much, much longer. But I'd like to point out one thing that he said that he was most proud of. He's, of course, very proud of his children, and with good reason. But he also said he was most proud of the fact that he did not know what the inside of a din Torah or a Beit Din looked like. Think about this. This is a person who was involved in million-dollar transactions, a person who was involved and certainly was himself a parnas in helping schools here in Chicago, in Eretz Israel, around the world. So he obviously had the great ability to be able to sustain institutions. And therefore, in order to do that, of course, he had to be involved with many, many business transactions. And he never, what he did was he put into operation on a daily level this pasuk, Ve'asita hayashar v'atov. And actually then, of course, it's very fitting among other psukim and other parshiot that certainly could have been on this very tragic and sad week in which we bid goodbye to Rabbi Yaakov Reichenbach. It's very fitting that this pasuk, I think, was actually one of the hallmarks of his life. So the first element that we learn here is, as Rashi tells us, is we are to do va'asita hayashar v'atov. And that means don't claim all of your rights all of the time. Now, the Gemara in Bab Metzia presents us with a very famous case. It's only famous if you've heard it more than once. If you haven't heard it, then it's not famous. But the Gemara in Bab Metzia, presents us with a situation. Rabbi Bar Vaetchanan, who was a Talmud and an Amora, said, that he had porters that he had employed to move barrels of wine from one place to another. So they broke one of the barrels of wine. Shaka l'glimai. What did he do? He said, all right, if you owe me for the wine, you were careless in what you did. So they couldn't pay him. So he said, give me your shirts. He took their shirts, which was apparently to some degree, the value of the wine that was lost. Also, so what did these porters do? They came, Amru Rav, they came to Rav. They came to the great Amora Rav, Amarle. So Rav said to Rabbi Bar Vaetchanan, Havlahu Glimai, give them their shirts. Amarle. So Rabbi Bar Vaetchanan said to Rav, Dina Hafi? Is this the halacha? Is this the halacha? Amarle. So he said to him, in. Rav said to him, yes, it is. Leman telech b'derech tovim. And he quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, in order that you should fill the mitzvah to go in the path of the good. Now, of course, the question has to be really asked here. Wait a minute. Why, if it's really dinah, if the halacha is that way for everybody in this case, so why didn't you quote a pasuk? Why didn't you quote a halacha? Rav quoted a pasuk in Mishlei, which of course teaches us Mishlei is dedicated written by Shlomo HaMelech, dedicated to teaching us how to live a good, meaningful, honorable life. So he gave him shirts back. His Rebbe told him to do that, so he did. And it doesn't end there. The porters said to Rabbi Vaetchanan, we're poor people. And we, Vaetchanan, Kula Yoma, and we worked all day. So now it's nice we got our shirts back, but you lost money, the kafninan, and we're very hungry, so we deserve to be fed. Letlan midi, and we have nothing to buy, to buy food with. Omar lay. So then Rav, who was listening to this exchange, said to Rav, the Rebbe, said to him, Zil, havagrayu, pay them their wages. Omar lay, dina hochi. So now Rabbi Bar Vaetchanan said, is that so? Is that the halacha? Omar lay, in the orchot tzadikim tishmu. He's not quoting a Musar Sefer here. Once again, he's quoting from Sefer Mishlei, and he says, the paths of the righteous you shall keep. So here, Rabbi Vaetchanan lost the wine, had to give back their shirts, and even had to pay them for what they were doing. So the question really is, and his Rebbe said, you have to do it, but he doesn't cite a halachic source. He cites a source in Mishlei, Nevi'im Achronim, Ksuvim actually. He cites a case, Psukim in Ksuvim, not apparently intended to be used to render a halachic. Seems to me, first of all, the guiding principle here is va'asita yashar v'at. And the reason the Torah does not make this an exact mitzvah is because this is a dictum that is not going to be fulfilled uniformly everywhere by everybody in every case. If these people weren't poor, you wouldn't have to pay them. The truth is, according to the strict halacha, if they were careless, so they shouldn't be paid. They didn't do the job they were told to do. And whether or not they should take their shirts, if that's all they had, that also appears that he may have at least been able to make the case that he should have been able to seize some property of theirs in order to be made whole from their carelessness. It seems here that by virtue of the fact that Rav chose not a halachic principle, but pasuk in Mishlei, which is very close to our pasuk v'asita hayashar v'hatov, is to tell us two things. Number one, not every case is given to be adjudicated according to the exact same principle. That's number one. Even though most are, of course. Otherwise, you'd never know what you're doing. The other thing, though, is that that these principles that we have are those that need to be rendered very carefully in accordance with unique situations. So this is the idea behind it. Sita yashar v'hatov. Now, the Torah Tamima, not the Torah Tamima, I'm sorry, Tosefta and Shkalim. The Tosefta and Shkalim uses this pasuk for a very interesting introduction. It is as follows. Nichnas Kohen HaMemuna Litrom et Halishka. The Tosefta in Masechet Shkalim. Now, Shkalim deals with the monies that are given to the Beis Hamikdash, and a Kohen would of course listen. They had pushkas, big pushkas there, very big, and they had to be emptied, and then they were used for korbanot. So a Kohen enters, and the Tosefta tells us that when the Kohen who was to empty these containers would enter the Beis Hamikdash, they would check his clothing at the beginning and at the end when he entered and when he left. Lomar achar kach im yetze, I'm sorry, shelo yuchal. Lomar achar kach im yetze im shkalim hevetim michutz lekan bevoli. So when they checked him on the way in, that would mean he had nothing. Check him at the end, he has nothing. If they didn't check him on the way in, and he has any money at all, they'll say, well, he stole it from the treasury. But they check them both in and out, so then they could be certain that he's not a ganav. Oh my goodness. We're talking about the Beis Hamikdash. We're talking about the Kohen, umedaber mimo, and then they would speak with him the whole time he was there, because maybe he might have put some coins in his mouth. Imagine that, right? From the time he came and left. Therefore, it fulfilled the mitzvah to fulfill the pasuk in Bamidbar that says that people who are involved with monetary issues should be clean and rendered clean regarding Hashem and the Jews. And then our pasuk is quoted. Hatov, that which is good, b'einei shamayim. You have to do that which is good in the eyes of heaven, means to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'hayashar, and which is yashar, af b'einei adam. You have to do both which is good in the eyes of heaven and on earth. Shenakiu chashad avon, so that he should be cleared from any apparent appearance of impropriety. Okay, Divrei Rabbi Akiva. So we see, interestingly, that even though people obviously have to act in an appropriate and correct manner, when it comes to public funds, everybody is subject to some doubt. Everybody can be subject to people's questioning. And we know that that's true. And so therefore, in the Beis Hamikdash, it was very apparent and very important that those people who were charged to handle the Kehila Shegelt, the money of the Kehila, it's not enough to trust. It was important that they should, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows whether they did anything inappropriate or not. But it's very important that the people feel the same way about their leaders, about the Kohanim, deal with these issues. Now, another example of the Asita HaYashar V'Hatov, dealing with that which is good and that which is proper, is found in the concept of Dina de Bar Metzah. There is a rule. Let's assume we have three properties side by side. Person who owns the middle property and wishes to sell it. So the right of first refusal goes to the people on either side. You say, what's the difference? It's my property. I should be able to sell it to whomever I want. The truth is, perhaps the Iker Hadin, perhaps in its purest form, the din would be that the person has the right to sell his property to whomever he wants. But the Din de Bar Metzah says, wait a minute, if this property is sold to someone in between who may or may not get along with the people on either side, that may prevent expansion of one side or the other. And so therefore, a person who may want to, let's say, a person on the east side, let's say middle and west side, so the person on the east side or the west side is entitled to put in a bid for that property. And if all things being equal, the property should go to the person on one side or the other. Let's assume that if there's on either side, there's a problem, that's something else. But the person who puts in the bid that is equal to the bid of another person who's, let's say, from outside the neighborhood. So it goes to him. Why? Because of Asita Hayasharvat. You have an obligation to think about the other person when you're involved in transactions, in business. Generally speaking, in our world, in the world of capitalistic world, and again, there is no perfect economic system. Every one of them has a drawback. One of the things that I point out is it could very well be that when we talk about the Eitz Chaim Das Tovara, Das Tovara, that Adam and Chava were not to eat from that. It's not just a matter of knowing the difference in good and bad, but once they partook of that Eitz Hadat Tovara, so what happened is what's good for me may not be good for you. That's what all business is. What's good for business is not necessarily good for the farmer. What's good for the farmer may or may not be good for the city business person, and what's good for unions may be bad for management, and so it goes and so it goes. There is no perfect economic system. Now, one of the important aspects of the economic system is the Rabbi, the great Tana Rabbi, once asked his students to identify the proper way or the proper system or outlook for people to live. I'm sorry, I just have to get my Pirkei Avot. We'll be with you in a second. Sorry to have kept you, I'm sorry. Rebbe asked the following of his students. Ezohi derech yishara. Notice the word yishara. What is that principle of straight path? Sheyavar lo hadam, that a person should choose. Kol shehi tiferet la'osa. He said, if you want to know whether it's in business or whether it's general interaction between one party and another, if you want to know, is it the right way to act? Kol shehi tiferet la'osa, tiferet lo min adam. The word tiferet, of course, is subject to a number of interpretations. Tefillin are called pe'er. Tiferet generally means majesty. But here I believe it means majesty, of course, but the dignity which recognizes the majesty of human beings. So he says anything which brings dignity to people. And what does that mean? Well, I think when he says this statement to his Talmidim, Rebbe is saying that there is the culture of advantage and the culture of tiferet. I'll explain the two. The culture of advantage is just about any economic system that we choose, particularly, of course, those which are open, free market trade, etc. Whoever can make the most money, as long as they do it legally and without deliberately harming or deceiving others, we generally say that's good. And that leads, though, the downside of that is that the idea of all being fair in love and war, the war being oftentimes fought on the economic plane, whatever gives me the advantage, as long as we're not talking about cheaters. We're not, and that already, of course, doesn't even come into the cabinet. But we look for advantage. That's the culture of advantage. So whether it's a drug company, two drug companies that are trying to get the drug first, as we know, with inoculations, et cetera, or whether it is a clothing industry, whatever, or it could be farming or food, we look for advantage. We have what we call the culture of advantage. Whoever gets the advantage will get more money. But there is a second culture, says Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And by the way, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was a very, very wealthy man. He said, there's another culture. There's a culture of tiferet. I have to ask myself, does this what does this do that I'm doing, and how am I acting? Is it that which promotes dignity of human beings, or is it merely promotes my pocket? And so we can say without question that nowadays in almost every culture, it's the culture of advantage that is prevalent. But Rebbe said every human being has to look at Yashar. He says, Ezo derech Yashar. What is the straight path that the Torah is talking about that gives us, that teaches us how to live? He says it's Tiferet. Tiferet is when we live with the intention of maintaining the dignity of the other person, whether it's through compromise, no matter what it may be through. That is the ideal way which a person lives a Torah life. I'll conclude by just telling you something that you also, I think, all know. Rabbi, Mr. Abraham Fierstein, whom many of you may have seen, he passed away recently, but he owned a very, very large clothing manufacturing in Massachusetts, Walden, Massachusetts. And he had paid, of course, a great deal for insurance. And one night, the entire operation, it was the biggest operation in, if not Massachusetts, it might even be more than that, in the United States, and it burnt to the ground. He was entitled to at least $500 million. He had paid for it. He was entitled to it. But in the meantime, thousands of workers at this operation did not know where their next paycheck would come from. So what did he do, Mr. First? Zichronu Livracha. He paid them. They didn't miss a paycheck. He gave them the bonus because it was in December. He gave them their winter bonus when it came, and he kept them employed. And then when he got paid from the insurance company, he put it right back into the company so that they would be paid and that they would be able to support their families. And then when they asked him, why did you do it? First thing he said is to be Makadesh Shem Shammai. He said that. And the second thing is he said, what am I going to do? Buy more clothes? What am I going to do? Buy another suit? Am I going to eat another meal? The whole idea, he understood implicitly and explicitly. He understood that which really counts is Vasita Hayashar Vato. Doing that which is good. And you can't define it. He was entitled to that money, period. He was entitled to go off to whatever Greek island he wanted to go to, as long as it had a shul and a minyan, and he could have gone there. But he didn't choose to take only what he was entitled to, because that's stuck in his mind. Vasita Hayashar Hato. He exemplified the concept not of advantage, but the concept of tiferet, of the concept of doing that which promotes the dignity of human beings. So Zichrona Livracha, may his memory be blessed, and that of our dear Chaver Yaakov Reichenbach Zatzal, and may we use their way of looking at the world of tiferet as a means to make our own lives more meaningful. Wish everybody a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Thanks so much.
Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Thank you. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos.